Hi guys, welcome to the Ancient Texans Notes for Mr. Jackson, Miss Fernandez, and Miss Morledge. As you watch this video, follow along with your Ancient Texans Notes. These are the notes that have the 4 different boxes. You need to go ahead and label each box with the appropriate era. You'll have Paleo-Indian in the upper left-hand corner. You'll have Archaic in the bottom left-hand corner. You'll have Late Prehistoric in the upper right-hand corner and Historic in the bottom right-hand corner. You'll notice that each box corresponds to a certain area on the timeline, and this shows you which part of history it occurred during. You'll also notice that there's a box that says present to 24, well, right now yours says 2013 CE. If you want to update that to 2014, go right ahead. If you need to pause here to take a time to write in your headings, go ahead. If you're with Mr. Jackson or Miss Fernandez, these notes need to go into your binder. If you're with Miss Morledge, they can go in your binder, or you can tape or glue them into your spiral in the warm-up/notes section. As we go throughout the video, feel free to pause at any time. Make sure you're putting things in your own words and in bullet point format. You do not need to reiterate everything you see on the slide or every single thing you hear me say. So our first time period is the Paleo-Indian period. You'll notice that the dates correspond to the ones on your timeline for the upper left-hand box, from 11,500 BCE to 8,000 BCE. As we begin talking about ancient Texans, the first thing that's important to notice is how did they get to Texas in the first place? Well, the main theory that you'll hear talked about is the idea that people crossed over on the Bering Land Bridge, or the Bering Strait, and that this occurred during the last ice age. These people are known as the Clovis people, and all of the culture that corresponds with these Clovis people is referred to as Clovis culture. The idea is that it was a group of hunter-gatherers from Siberia, and they needed to follow the things that they were hunting and gathering, the animals, etc. So as the animals moved, they moved. This was their food supply, so they had to move as it moved. As you'll see on the next slide, at this time, Siberia was connected to Alaska through this Bering Land Bridge. At the time, this was really just a big block of ice that was about a mile wide. As it was during the Ice Age, many of the oceans were frozen over, therefore subsiding the amount of water, and therefore there was this land, this 1 mile wide bridge that people believe this Clovis culture just simply walked over. Once this culture made it to North America, wasn't North America at the time, but once they made it to present-day North America, they continued to follow their food, and the theory has that they followed them all the way south and into Texas eventually. The lifestyle, as I'm sure you can guess, was that of nomadic hunters. Nomadic meaning that they will move from place to place. This is going to be one of your vocab terms for the unit that you will learn during next class. So these nomadic hunters continued to follow their food supply. They did not stay in one place very long. They went wherever the food went. How do we know that this is what happened? Well, there's really a lot of evidence that shows us about the Paleo-Indian period. Some of this evidence includes large bison jumps and mammoth kill sites that were used for hunting. Some of these were found in Texas at the Lubbock Lake Landmark in the Panhandle area. You'll notice the picture of the spearheads. This was one of the very earliest tools that we find, some of this with the evidence. Here's an image of the Bering Strait or the Bering Land Bridge that we just talked about. You'll notice that the red arrow points to where once was a piece of land that allowed these Clovis people to cross from Siberia to Alaska. It's really interesting to point out that this might not be the earliest people group. The idea of the Clovis culture being the first group and the way that people settled North America originally, way back when, with this idea of Clovis culture. But recently there have been remains found in many different areas, including Chile, but most importantly to us, there's remains of a settlement at Buttermilk Creek Complex, which is right near Salado, Texas. The dating of the artifacts that they found date back to before the Clovis period. In this case, it would prove that there was people here before the Clovis culture, and therefore proving that theory incorrect. Our next period on the timeline is the Archaic period. You'll notice this was about 8,000 to 2,000 years ago, or 6,000 BC to 0 CE, CE being the current era. It started warming up a bit. The glaciers started to retreat. Therefore, it ends the Bering Strait. As the water melted, the land that supposedly the Clovis people walked over was covered again with water. This warmer environment led to the possible extinction of some of the larger animals, as well as the fact that these early people might have simply annihilated these larger animals through their hunting. Therefore, while these people were still considered hunter-gatherers, they hunted smaller mammals like buffalo and deer. They also began gathering berries and seeds around their sites. The population increased because they were less nomadic. As they started hunting these smaller animals and gathering berries and seeds, they didn't move quite as much. This meant they were more sedentary, another vocab word that you'll learn later. They even started domesticating animals. Because the people were more sedentary, they were able to start trading. This is also the beginning of the surfacing of rock painting. Rock painting was a way that people used to communicate during that time. They were able to tell stories and also send messages to people who came after them. Some of these images of rock art can still be seen throughout Texas today. Where you saw spears in the Paleo-Indian period, here you'll see a new tool called the atlatl. This was used as a hunting tool. It had a hook on one end, and you put the original spear into the hook, and you were able to throw it at whatever was coming. You could consider it an early bow and arrow, which came later on. Again, how do we know any of this? Well, there's actually evidence in Texas at Seguin. One day, a man by the name of Mr. McKee just moved some soil on his property. The next night, it rains, and it washes away all the dirt. And when he wakes up, there's spears, there's tools, there's evidence of all these different artifacts. They think this site in Seguin used to be an old trading post. Archaeologists have been studying the various artifacts found here and starting to date them and try to figure out which exact period it might be from. Here's an example of the rock art that you will see throughout Texas. Most of the Texas rock art will be found in the Lower Pecos and Trans-Pecos regions. These can tell stories and also date sites. Not only do they tell us about some of the traditions, it tells us how people lived. It can also tell us when they lived there. This brings us to the late prehistoric period. This is from 700 of the modern day era to 1500. The lifestyle starts to become a bit more permanent. They start building settlements. They even develop improved agriculture as they're able to stay in one area longer and see their agriculture and their planting through all the different phases to growth. Some of the agricultural crops that they start growing are maize, an early type of corn, beans, and squash. Because they're a little bit more permanent, they start having a bit more of leisure time. No, they didn't watch TV, they didn't play their Xbox, but they started developing pottery, as you can see in the picture to the right, and they also started developing advanced weapons and tools. This is when we first see the bow and arrow. They have more time to spend on these advancements because they're not spending all their time out hunting and gathering because they have this more permanent settlement. The evidence for this can be found in the Tortuga Flat site, where there's lots and lots of rock art, where we've learned about their life, about their tools, and the dating of when all this happened. The final period is the historic period. This brings us from 500 years ago to present day. Now, when we say present day, yes, that would be 2014, but the main focus should be on about the founding of the U.S. during European exploration. When we talk about their culture and their new tools and technology, we're not talking about iPhones and about laptops. We're talking about different kinds of metal goods, metal weapons, all that kind of stuff. So although this does bring us to present day, the historic period should be thought of as characterized by European exploration. lifestyle becomes even more sedentary and agriculture is heavily used and heavily relied on. Because of this, there's new crops, which are also brought from the Europeans. Along with that is new disease and tools and technology. All of these things were traded between the Europeans and the Native Americans. Notice, this would be an example of cultural diffusion, being the sharing of cultures. This specific example of cultural diffusion is known as the Columbian or Great Exchange. As I said, the tools and technology during this time mainly came from trading them with advanced weapons that the Europeans brought, as well as creating their own metal tools. The evidence that we have of the historic period is largely based on the written accounts. However, these written accounts are almost entirely European. Just a piece of thought, what might this mean to us? How might we think through what we know based on the fact that almost all of the accounts we read are European? Just something to think about. But these written accounts are the new modern-day form of rock art. Where they used to leave their drawings behind, now there is actually a written form to show us what happened, when it happened, and how it happened. That's it for your Ancient Texans notes. Feel free to go back, rewatch things, pause at certain points. If you have any questions that came up throughout this, make sure to write them on the back of your notes, and when we talk about them in class, ask your questions and we'll get more in depth with the material. Thanks, guys.